My name is Ben Valentine, welcome to my channel. And if you're like me and you love oil painting, but don't love drawing with graphite or charcoal quite as much as oil painting, this video is for you. So spoiler alert, we're going to be talking about using monochrome with oil paint as a drawing method. So you can finally stop feeling guilty about not drawing enough and still scratch that oil painting itch. Quick side note, you see that I'm using a reddish brown pastel pencil here. The only reason I'm really doing that is to get placement of the face, and I knew that I wanted to leave some of the canvas color exposed in the final painting, and laying everything out with an erasable media like this is the most reliable way to do that. So definitely feel free to draw with the brush if you're more comfortable with that. So why am I recommending drawing and painting with monochrome oil paint instead of working in full color? Well, the idea doesn't come exactly from me. It actually comes from Harold Speed's excellent drawing book, The Practice and Science of Drawing. And you see that it's a drawing book. And in this drawing book, he recommends basically two distinct ways for students to practice drawing. His first method he recommends is what he calls line drawing. Line drawing is a specific way of drawing where pretty much all the marks that make up the drawing are made with lines. So it's made up almost completely of hatch marks and contour lines, as you can see in his beautiful examples here. Now, I may cover his line drawing concepts in another video, but suffice it to say, it's a really brilliant idea, and he kind of breaks it down in a way that explaining that line is a conceptual idea. It's about the contour of an object, and it's related to our sense of touch. So the way that we draw a line is deeply connected to how we feel things with our hands mostly. So the side of the nose that we feel on our face, the side of our cheek, the side of our arm is sort of integrated into our consciousness and is expressed by way of line when we are doing line drawing. So it's a purely conceptual idea. The Renaissance painters and draftsmen were very much within the line category of draftsmen and painters. He contrasts that with what I think is very interesting. The other way he recommends drawing is with mass drawing, and his recommendation is by way of using raw umber and white oil paint. And this way of drawing is distinct from line drawing in the way that instead of being conceptual like line drawing and happening in our mind, it's more focused on the visual impression of light and shadow reaching our retina and being processed by our brain. And again, like I said, such a brilliant way to sort of separate the two disciplines, the two major concepts of realistic painting. The conceptual, what's in our brain, what we know about things in line, and the visual impression, what the impressionists were after, the way that light hits our retina and we see light and shadow. Painters that live more in this visual 2D realm would be Velázquez, Rembrandt to a degree, Sargent to a very big degree. And sort of through this understanding and encouragement of his book and his writing, I myself as a student that was learning it was like I was given permission to learn to paint or learn to draw with oil paint. And like I said in the beginning, I have found it to be the most efficient way to learn, because oil painting without the complication of color has many complications. There's many things there's many processes that we're trying to work with all at once. We have pressure sensitivity, how much we've loaded the brush, brush stroke direction, how thickly or thinly we are applying the brush, how fluid the paint is, whether we've added medium or not. If we want thicker, more loose brush work, if we want more tightly rendered, form-focused brush work. These are all massive subjects, and they take a ton of mental energy, and I would argue they're far more complicated than understanding color. Color, by comparison, is a relatively finite process. It's a finite thing. The amount of visible color that we can see, even though it's many millions of colors, for our purposes is quite a bit more compressed than that. And we can understand color quite easily. after a little bit of practice. It's a pretty mathematical process versus the much more complicated and creative processes, like I explained, not even mentioning proportion, edges, values, value keying, the emotional impact of value keying. So whether we have like a high key composition or a low key composition or a mid key composition, these all have various emotional impacts, etc. Now, a big mistake I think, beginner students will often make with this idea of monochrome is that they may think, okay, I'll do like one monochrome. I've done some drawing. I know how to draw. So I'll do one monochrome painting and then move on to color. I think that's a big mistake. For myself, I continually and have continuously gone back to monochrome whenever I'm learning or wanting to practice a specific dimension of oil painting, whether it's super thick, interesting impasto, whether it's working with a very loose underpainting like Rembrandt did, whether it's exploring very refined, tightly rendered forms so that I can understand the portrait and I can understand the figure better, practicing layering oil paint and how translucency and opacity interact with one another, and even using near monochrome as a basis for a finished work. And with all those sort of possibilities, my goal of this particular video isn't necessarily a how-to on how you do a monochrome, as much as it is in a to be honest way, is to try to get my brain to sort of influence your brain to sort of adopt this practice of monochrome oil painting as a distinct practice of learning and improving and practicing so that you can get better at painting in I think, a much quicker way. One thing I didn't mention earlier that I would like to talk about is that when we're painting with color, something that happens is it's relatively easy to get a flesh-colored, fleshy look. And what I find that often happens with students is the read that we're getting off of our portrait is that, hey, it's doing pretty good. At least it looks fleshy, at least it looks like flesh. That's kind of what it's telling our brain is like, at least we have this sort of nice, warm, flesh-looking thing, But everything else can be totally weird and off. And what happens when we remove that sort of superficial color layer and we focus specifically on the monochrome, it sort of tells our brain, these are the things that we need to work on, It doesn't give our brain that out like, okay, we did fine. It looks like skin. And it gives our brain problems to start working on, and it'll see, okay, proportion is the thing that I need to start working on. It'll be working on it for like, even when we're not painting, it'll be working on that problem, or it's our values are off, we're getting too dark in the shadows, or we're getting too light in the lights, or whatever. And it starts to open up our mind and tell us what we need to be working on, because I assure you it's not color. It's almost never color. It's almost never color that's the problem. Now, with all that said, I think I can give you some precise material suggestions to use for your practice of monochrome painting. I recommend a gray-toned either canvas or panel to start with. Make sure it's dry so you're not fighting with a slippery wet tone. In this example, I used a linen canvas that I pre-toned with Mars black and a little bit of flake white, thinned with a little tiny bit of solvent, but just spread very vigorously with a rag. For paints, I recommend relatively opaque paints. I'm using Michael Harding Van Dyke Brown and Williamsburg Flake White. The Van Dyke Brown is very opaque, and the reason opaque paint is useful in this particular example, since we're doing a number of layers here, is that once the paint is dry and we're painting on top of it, we can allow a little bit of translucency to happen if our paint is pretty thin, and the color isn't going to change that much from the underlayer as it would if we were using more like sort of translucent paints or transparent paints. Using very minimal medium addition here, I have a little bit of walnut oil gel that's sitting on my palette that I dip into just to help lubricate the paint a little bit if it's getting a little too sticky. And of course, if you're a beginner, you don't need to use lead white. Definitely use titanium white until you have a lot more comfortability with your materials. Other than that, I hope this video has at the very least inspired you to pick up up your paint brushes and your two tubes of paint and get to work on this super rewarding practice that, like I've said a few times, definitely the most efficient way to learn oil painting, to get better at oil painting, or even to practice and pick up different skills in oil painting if we've been painting for a long time. By the way, I've included a high resolution image of the final study in the description if you'd like to check it out. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps me a lot. I also hold regular online Zoom classes, 5 weeks on, 5 weeks off throughout the year, covering numerous classical painting topics. So please check those out in the description. I also have a self-paced Rembrandt master copy course. One of the best things I've ever made in my life. I'm super proud of it. Over 700 students so far. Check it out in the description as well. Thanks. See you next time.